Daphne.
No, because I was doing that, right, but it's just big, so that's good. I knew how to get to this building, I didn't know. No, but originally I was sent to go to Park Avenue. Yeah.
All right, folks, I think I'm going to begin. People come in a few minutes after. My name is Louis Premkes, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. Daphne Merkin, to my left, is one of our most talented writers, a writer's writer. She is the author of 5 books, 2 novels, a memoir, and 2 collections of essays. She has written about Freud and spanking and multifarious other subjects, all with unique insight, wit, and perception. Other writers, including myself, read Daphne for fun and ideas when we are looking to inspire ourselves. She is just that good. Thus, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Daphne to you this evening. And this is how I do it. Daphne? You take the mic and I'll sit where you sit.
Okay.
Here, not here. Here?
And we'll go in back of the mic.
I mean here.
Yeah.
First
He's
of all.
talking into it. Is it too high for you?
Hi. No, can you hear me? Yes.
Afterwards, there are books here that Daphne will be happy to inscribe if you wish to purchase them. Okay.
I'm happy to be here, whether it's 12 or 32. The only person I invited was my daughter, who did not come. I teach at Barnard and did invite some students, but I did it so belatedly, which was yesterday, that they thought they mostly couldn't come. But
Daphne, were you speaking to the microphone?
I thought I was. Is that better?
Better.
Okay.
Do you want me to lower it? Or shut it?
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
Tiny bit. Thank you. Perfect. Yes. Better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've taught here under Lewis's auspices, which I have enjoyed, and I also taught when Lewis was at Marymount. And now I taught at the Columbia MFA program. Now I'm teaching at Barnard. My most consistent opinion is that writers don't read enough. I've never, ever encountered a writer who wrote well, who didn't read a lot. And in some way, I remember when I started them at Columbia, there was one student who kept asking me what should her brand be or something. And I thought, what brand? I mean, unless you're Kim Kardashian, you don't need a brand. Whom I've written about twice in my writing about high and low culture. Anyway, I'm talking tonight about a subject that I've given a lot of thought to.
Daphne, could you just lift the microphone just a touch up?
Better?
Much better.
Okay. Which is, how does one write personally or internally in an age that is so externalized, non-psychological? By that I mean Trump, obviously, but the whole climate around Trump, which is not one of great self-exploration. So, having given this a lot of thought, here is what I made of it. It is hardly, can you hear me? It is hardly a new thought to observe that writing is a lonely affair, a conversation with oneself played out on the keyboard in the hope that others will eventually listen in. There are, however, different kinds of loneliness. Writing journalism, as I've extensively done, be it in the form of interviews, reviews, or reportage, is more in the way of writing to order, and as such requires less suspension of disbelief, less hope that there is an audience out there to receive what you have to offer. With journalism, there's an assignment to be filled, an editor waiting impatiently on the other end to receive it, and your observing self is put in the service of things outside yourself. A book, a film, a celebrity, a public event, a war. Writing of this kind does not require an inner engagement so much as an engagement with the ongoing world and an ability to comment articulately on that world, whether in a micro or macro fashion. There has always been this kind of writing. At the best, it was featured in the Old New Yorker, but now it is more generally conceived of as the contents of the morning paper or the evening news. But with the advent of digital culture, and in particular social media, this kind of opinion writing has mutated into quick takes, let's call it punditry, and has been given a fresh impetus. Opinions on everything, from who wore what to the Oscars, to President Trump's takedown of Zelensky, proliferate on Substacks and podcasts, not to overlook the so-called influencers on TikTok or Facebook itself, although I don't know if anyone's on Facebook at this point. There is so much of this form of instant, untested, and unreflexive response by lesser and better known writers that you can spend hours at a time wading through it. How much of this polarized media babble, if I may call it that, adds to anyone's understanding of current events, as they used to be called in grade school, is anyone's guess. For sure, these pieces are chock-a-block with facts and factoids and historical tidbits and references to earlier takes on the situation being discussed. But they often, at least to my way of thinking, seem like dangling additions made by people with big egos and a determination to be in the limelight to a larger, more complex interchange. I might add, just for the record, that they are primarily written by men. And I would also add that in times as culturally fragmented as ours are, riven by identity politics and without a common sense of history or literature, chasing the limelight is something of a fool's errand, best achieved by hiring an expensive publicist. What I would like to focus on this evening is a different form of writing entirely, which is creative writing that takes its inspiration from private experience. This is writing that comes from inside out and is openly subjective, calling on external reality as it sees fit to, but not subsumed by it. It is the reigning impulse behind novels, memoirs, poetry, and personal essays, inviting us to share in an individual story that might or might not speak to others. It is writing that has often dismissively been characterized as confessional, beginning with the shift in Robert Lowell's poetry from a magisterial voice to an intimate one that made use of private documents, including most controversially letters from his ex-wife, the writer Elizabeth Harper. In his wake came a gang of poets, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, John Berriman, W.D. Snodgrass, who dared to construct poems out of material that partook of messy truths, including stays in mental hospitals, that elicited admiration but also unease. The response of these poets, as well as the later response to some of, say, Philip Roth's more scabrous fiction, always puts me in mind of the Yiddish expression, es passt nicht, which roughly translates into it does not suit a Jew to do such a thing. Although I would argue that for all the ease of production this writing sometimes conveys, sounding like someone just decided to start talking willy-nilly about his or her life, it is harder and riskier to do than most other kinds of writing. For one thing, it requires putting one's heart, whatever kind of heart it may be, as well as one's mind on the page. There is no hiding under an official byline or the cover of a recognized news outlet. There is you, the writer. Somewhere dancing on the edge of the horizon, there are potential readers, and way, way out there is the possibility of publishing. As one writer famously put it, there's a controversy about who it was, some attributing it to Hemingway and others to the great sports writer Red Smith. Quote, "You simply sit down at the typewriter, open your veins, and bleed." Melodramatic as this sounds, I think there was truth to it then, and I think there is even more truth to it now, in the age of Trump. The assumptions that once drove creative writing, that there was virtue in dissent, that the vulnerable among us deserved equal attention as the winners, that psychological conflict was something that afflicted all of us and was worthy of examination, that in short, interior life deserved to be taken up with as much respect and interest as the latest bump in relations at the White House. These assumptions no longer obtain. It defies belief that magazines of ideas, like the originally left-leaning small circulation quarterly, The Partisan Review, I am ancient enough to have been on its editorial board, invited vociferous public debate with articles by George Orwell, James Baldwin, Saul Bellow, and Susan Sontag. Or that a critic, like Lionel Trilling, was not only invited to an evening at JFK's White House, but that the president knew who he was, and his wife Jackie asked Trilling if he thought D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow was Lawrence's best book. Sounds exactly like Melania. I say it defies belief because no one, except for a tiny cadre, cares anymore about what Diana Trilling, Lionel's wife, called, quote, the life of significant contention. What we care about now are all the exigencies of the external life. Taxes, status symbols, AI, the latest iPhone, and a brand new light blue model of Apple Air, what colleges we can push our children into, and how much Trump's vindictive mandates will touch us personally. Identity politics have changed. Subtle examinations of racism, sexism, and colonialism into unnuanced, shrilled announcements in which the party line, although unstated, is more extreme than the party line that dictated J. Edgar Hoover's pursuit of communist leanings among American intellectuals in the 1950s. Instead of political analysis, we have people holding bifurcated positions, which demonize positions not their own, and construe the people who hold the, quote, wrong position as fatally flawed. Well, what you may ask has this to do with creative writing? To which question I would answer everything. The center has to hold, if I may paraphrase the poet Yeats, for there to be counter views and oddball opinions and impassioned accounts of lives lived outside the box. We always characterize the 1950s as the decade of conformity, but for a long time I've believed that the past decade or two have been ones of conformity and growing ever more so. To write personally, you need to believe that there are stirrings beneath the surface, that we don't live in an entirely flattened culture. As Alana Newhouse argued in a recent essay in Tablet called Everything is Broken. We need to begin to crawl out from under the debris and chaos that Trump has managed to create in an astonishingly short amount of time, and remind ourselves that Elon Musk's so-called brilliance is only brilliance of a specific sort, that humanitarian values and cogitation have nothing to do with it. We need to remind ourselves that the savagery of strongmen leaders should not be allowed to infiltrate what we dream of or wonder about. I've been teaching a course on depression this past term at Barnard. We've been reading books like Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, William Steinman's Darkness Visible, and Elizabeth Wurtzel's Prozac Nation. They are all intensely personal, sometimes annoyingly so, but they also take me and my students to places to do with the definition of the self and the construction of society that we may have bypassed or been too afraid to consider. All of the books I've chosen for the syllabus recognize and occasionally address the historical context in which they are or were written, but they are primarily focused on personal experience, which includes the influence of childhood, the price of talent, the burden of depression, and what happens when you compulsively seek attention because you've been deprived of early nurturance. These issues are not irrelevant. Trump too began in childhood with a bullying father and a chilly mother, and grew up to reflect these circumstances. Looking inward and writing about one's own experience is not merely a self-indulgent exercise in navel-gazing. It can help us understand others, be they Ukrainians or our next-door neighbors, and learn that there is more commonality between us than this supernally divisive moment in time would have us know.
Thank you, Daphne. You want to answer to me? Just sit down in this chair. All right, who has questions for Daphne?
If no one does, I need not sit down.
Go ahead, sit. I have a bad hip, so it takes me hours to sit.
Okay.
Okay.
Anyone?
Well, all right, I'll ask
Anne.
a question. I recently wrote a memoir because my children wanted me to, and it was something I did from the, can you hear me? From the internet, which I'm not very good at, but
What do you mean
Well-
you did it from the internet?
well, because they sent me a question every Monday,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to answer that question about my life. For instance, it could have been,
Excuse
What?
me, the mic, please use the.
oh, sorry, oh, I'm not used to a mic, goodness. Okay, so it asked a question and you answered the question. It could have been, what was your relationship with your father? It could have been, which was 3 pages. It could have been, how do you like to travel? Half a page, first class. So I'm asking you, I think that helped me. I think it helped me to bring out some of the sad things. My husband died when I was quite young, when he was quite young. I was in the war, so I'm 85, so I was in the war. So I was able to tell some of the sad things that happened. And I think it helped, and I think the children enjoyed it. It wasn't a sad book, it was just a page about certain things of my life.
But when you say,
So I do think that helps, is what I'm getting
right,
to,
but when
really.
you say it helped, what?
The writing, the actual writing of it.
It helped,
And
the right,
bringing the things back in my mind.
you mean these questions on the internet?
Yeah, they were just
But I would
questions.
argue that any questions
Yeah.
your children would ask you
Yeah.
would help. They could also pre-internet have been typed.
Yeah,
So my objection to the internet doesn't have to do with that kind of use of it
oh.
at all. I
Well,
mean,
it
that's-
was the only way I was gonna do it, because I would never have sat down and written it
Right,
if somebody hadn't asked me the question.
right.
And that's why they bought it for me for my 80th birthday. And now they all have a book, and a few friends have a book, and friends were in the book, so it's kind of fun.
Right.
And it helped me to realize why I perhaps had some of my hang-ups.
Right,
That was what I was enjoying.
yeah. But I think writing about one's having done it a few times, one's own life makes you come to some kind of terms or non-terms with what brought about how you are, how you think. So all I'm really saying is my question about digital social media has nothing to do with that use of the internet, which seems as useful as can be.
Yeah. Good.
Anyone else? In the back, and then you next.
I'm interested, Daphne, in all that you describe of this current moment and kind of that just veneer, an inch deep, and everything is outrage and objectionable. I'm wondering if you find that it has a suppressing or oppressing effect on your own creativity or articulation. Do you find it harder to go to that place where you really are examining and reflecting?
Right.
Because I feel that way.
I completely agree.
Ugh.
I feel, in particular, I'm not, maybe it'd be better for me as a writer if I were, I'm not particularly or at all involved in social media. But I would sometimes write pieces that were controversial, like I very early on actually wrote the only questioning piece in the New York Times about Me Too. And my daughter said to me, "You should see what they're saying about you." She has very nice eyes too. I don't think I would have written some of what I wrote in this culture. I do agree with you that it's restrictive. I think there's very little room. Again, I'm sort of referring to digital life. There's very little room for disagreement. There are also so many vindictive and not particularly articulate people on it that I think they can bar the way for self-examination. Because if you enter the halls of self-examination, you're always putting yourself up for judgment. Like in my class, was this the last book we read? No. When we read Prozac Nation, the author of whom, Elizabeth Russell, I knew very, very well, she is explicitly, I believe, wittingly unlikable much of the time. Certainly the class found her that way. She's also smart and funny, but I think what you're describing leads to a certain lack of daring, a kind of caution about what you put out there, which I think is fatal for the arts.
Disaster.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A disaster.
I mean, the one, I was going to say the one not plus of Trump, since I think woke culture is mostly deadly, not thought through, silencing, less wokeism, I think will allow for this great desired diversity of opinion.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last sentence? Because first you were saying that you were against woke culture,
Yeah, I said,
and you said something about left.
I
woke.
said the one thing about Trump
Right,
is
no,
there
I-
is, and with less woke culture,
less.
it will actually be greater diversity, not less, because it leaves room for people who don't agree with the going opinion, which is what makes for intellectual debate, of which there is astonishingly little. As someone who writes for a lot of magazines, I'm sometimes taken aback that they basically are saying similar things in a different voice. There just isn't it wasn't like in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't a restriction also on what people accepted, but it wasn't in the form of woke culture, that you're not aware enough of racism, you're not aware enough of sexism, you're not aware. It's a kind of, for me, handcuffs. But that's how I view it.
I mean, my question was going to be about, the list of words that appeared in the Times yesterday, which supposedly are to be taken out of all government documents. It wasn't censoring other kinds of writing yet, but when I saw that list of words, which many of them you might associate with wokeism, but some of them were just perfectly ordinary words, like woman, but not man, black, but not white, institutional, but.
But I think, to be honest, let me say, he did not read the list. I think it depressed me, the very thought. And I think the use, that kind of governmental use of what you could call DEI?
Yeah.
Is a different use than secular, non-governmental culture. I mean, if you teach, I taught a class, strange that they let me, in erotic writing at Columbia's MFA program. And before the class began, I said, all of the books we're going to read were written before the age of consent. Meaning, to constantly bring up, but did she agree, wasn't to the point. And there was some kind of faculty meeting where teachers were asked what they had gotten from their class, and I said I had learned that the new foreplay was choking. And then a year later there was a piece on the ubiquitousness of choking.
Yeah, I remember that.
So this is sort of to say there are different worlds, the governmental world and the academic world. I think the academic world has been muzzled by wokeness in many, many areas. And a lowering of that issue can only be good for it. But that's different than.
Right. No, I understand that list was governmental, but I worry about it moving over to the more general world. As a librarian, I worry about censorship, and I'm primarily have been a children's librarian my whole life, and I've worked in diverse situations, and what before diverse, multicultural situations, and that's really been what my whole career and anything I've written, most of what I've written has been about that.
Let's move on a little bit, give someone else a chance. There are some other people who had questions. Go ahead.
So I have an interesting experiment going on in my household. My wife watches all the news and social media. She gets the Twitter and all that, and I don't watch anything, right? I get up at 5 in the morning, I read a book for 2 hours, I go walk my dogs, I go to the gym, and I'm not paying any attention to it. And I feel like I'm being apathetic to a certain extent, but I'm not as stressed out as my wife is. She's like all over the place. Yesterday she was ready to cry, and I said, "What's the matter?" She's like,
Jim, I'll call you
You
back,
know.
I'm in the middle of it.
"He did this. I don't even know what he did." You know, she got a Ukrainian flag for her
Right.
car, right?
Okay, bye.
And
I tend to,
I've lost weight, and you know, I'm ignoring the whole thing.
right,
And I said to her, I have a book that was given to me by Mr. Trump before he was president, and I wanted to bring it. It was signed, "I heard you're a nice person, Donald Trump," right? And I wanted you to sign and say, "I heard you're not a nice person."
I have to say the 3 people I happen to know who've had dinner with Donald Trump all said the same thing, which I don't entirely doubt. I mean, I think they all said, and they were very different. One was an editor of a magazine, one was Woody Allen, I forgot who the third, and the third had a son who was involved with the administration, so that would have, they all said he was witty and charming.
Witty. Witty?
I can see witty, I think occasionally he is witty, in a
Witty.
slightly juvenile way.
Bullying way.
Yeah.
Witty.
It's a country club
No.
mentality where, you know, the men
Right.
talk about the women and, you know.
I would just say, to agreement with you, since I have a daughter who follows everything and comes home and says the world is ending, I guess in part to preserve myself from a sense, what I get in response to it is a sense of futility.
Yeah.
Like, why write something intelligent? Why engage? So I try to stay, which isn't to say I don't follow any, isn't Twitter called X now?
Yeah.
I went for 2 minutes on Twitter when one of my books was coming out. And I remember my daughter told me huffily I had no idea how to use Twitter. And I wasn't saying what Twitter, I think I went on about Virginia Woolf. This is not what you're supposed to do on Twitter. So I have stayed away from it.
But I have a real question though, that was just a comment. So you wrote a memoir as well as 2 fictional, or 4 fictional books? In your first, did you write the memoir first and then go on to fiction, or did you start with fiction and then go to write a memoir?
Well, first of all, the whole memoir issue has become an enormous one in publishing, mostly that it is immensely hard now to get a memoir published, in part because the whole idea of a platform, who are you? My first novel was intensely autobiographical, and some, maybe years later, it would have been published as a memoir, except that it had a lot of invented things in it.
Mhm.
And I went on, took me, the memoir I wrote was about depression, and that took me about 30 years to step up to the plate.
Interesting.
I mean, I was in book publishing for 6 years. I love well-done memoirs.
There's always a magic moment in there when, you know, they do something that the
Right.
success comes out of. I love those moments and the magic of the words.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We'll have 2 more, and that's it.
What?
The gentleman over here.
What?
You.
I hope you don't mind if I change the subject. We met very briefly at an event for Andrew Blauner's book. That you have this great essay, just great, I mean, about Martha Freud. And at the risk of asking a writer about a work in progress, or potential work in progress, I'm very curious to know, like, are you still working on, as you mentioned that night, a book on Martha Freud? I read elsewhere that you were writing a book on psychoanalysis more generally, and I'm
Yeah.
just so curious to
Right.
know. And also, thank you for this talk. I feel like you just delivered a sort of manifesto. It was
Thank you.
just really great.
Thank you.
So I'm curious to know what you're working, if that
Right.
book is taking shape.
I wish I could say with great confidence that I was fascinated by Martha Freud. I was, learned a lot that I didn't know about the whole Freud family. Was originally, but this was one of my original never done things, there were 2 series of Jewish Lives. Was going to do her for the series, but I ultimately wasn't sure there was that much more to say about her unless I went into a lot of speculation about the marriage. There was very little known about her. I have been procrastinating on a memoir about therapy and the ways in which it goes, and a relationship with a therapist, what is therapeutic love, the whole issue of which psychoanalysis loves to discuss, boundary violations. And I've been working on that on and off between writing endless pieces.
One more
I'd love
question.
to read it.
What?
Love to.
Who? Was there another question, the young lady with the blue hat?
Young, oh, okay. Daphne, thank you very much
Welcome.
for composing these, beautifully done.
Thank you.
There's, the audience isn't there anymore. I mean, it's like, when I have friends who tell me that they don't, oh, I used to read books.
Right.
And they say, I'm reading now, but it's a totally different kind, I mean, they call it reading. And by the way, for dyslexic people, it's much easier to do the internet, to do the digital. They can actually, they can do it where they couldn't do the other.
What is your question?
Well, maybe I don't, maybe I don't have a question, I'm saying,
That there isn't, I thought you were sort of saying that the culture of reading
yeah, I mean, the audience, I mean, if there aren't any writers still read for the most part, but readers who aren't writers
don't.
right. They
Well,
know
the truth of the matter is, since I was in book publishing for 6 years, 99% of Americans read 1 book a year. There has never been a very large American readership. I think certainly not for what's called literary novels, which are the novels I love, usually based on language, perception more than plot. That audience has always been, I just was discussing it with this former editor of the Times Book Review, that audience has always been about 2,000 to 3,000 readers for that kind of novel. And then you get the commercial novels and the, whatever her name is, Kathleen Hoover, and they outdo by a long shot. In some way I would agree with you, to invoke Diana Trilling again, with whom I was very close. She once said there's no echo anymore. And that was years ago. And in some ways, I think partly because people are fragmented, the culture is fragmented, there isn't a sustained response to anything that goes out there, or a cohesive, I mean more, which doesn't stop people from writing. I'm always struck how many people want to write. I always feel like telling them there are no readers, but I write myself in the hope that there are some readers. So I think that culture will continue and maybe one day get stronger again. When people are tired of screaming and all the internet has to offer.
Thank you, Daphne, for a lovely talk. Thank you all for coming. If anyone would like to purchase one of Daphne's books and come up and ask her further questions, feel free.